to this talk on Storybook, y'all. My name is Milecia McGregor, and I'm a tech everything. Like, I've done front-end, back-end, DevOps, blockchain, VR, games, management, whatever. So today, I'm super excited to tell y'all about Storybook and a little bit about Redwood, if you're not familiar with it. And if you do have any questions, y'all can just yell them out. I don't care. It's fine. And if you want to keep up to date with any content that I put out, of course, I got to put the Twitter plug in here. So @FlippedCoding. But we can go ahead and jump into it. So what is the problem with front-end development? That's definitely a loaded question, but we're only talking about one of them today. So you have this complex app that changes the UI based on data, which is pretty much all of them except like blogs and static content. So you want to make sure that you have reusable UI components, right? That way you don't have to keep rewriting code, reinventing the wheel. You can just use what you already got. But the problem is that this leads to developing your components together with the app. I know that might sound a little weird because it's like, well, what else do we do? But what I mean is that when we develop components as we build the app and we're integrating everything together at the same time, it leads to this issue where we have duplicate components across different pages because we need slightly different functionality because those pages have different data. And when we aren't thinking about the component design first, then it leads to just these issues with duplication. We have to go back and refactor things, and it makes maintenance really complicated because you see these similarly named components across different pages, and you swear you updated this one, but it was actually the component for the other page. So that is the problem that we're going to talk about solving today. I don't know why it had that, but we're going to do a little bit of component-driven development. And basically what this means is we're taking one component at a time. So maybe you have a button component, a form, some kind of drop-down, and you build that component in complete isolation from the rest of the app. So it's not on any particular page. It's not in any particular view. You just have a button component. And what you do over time is as you have these individual components, it's a lot like Legos. You start to slowly put them together. So maybe you have buttons and you need a group of them. That would be a combination of components. Or you have some kind of form and you start to add features like dynamic drop downs and things like radio selects and all that good stuff. You're just taking each component and adding onto it. And over time, as you build up these combination of components, you get your pages. So you have a page that maybe a user goes to update some settings for their account. That page is way more complex than just the submit button that they click to make the update. But it's just built up of all of these different smaller components, which is the whole point. You aren't starting from the big picture. You're starting from the smallest elements that you can code. And as you make your pages, you add the pages to the app, and then you're done, because that's how programming works. One day we finish and we never touch the code again. But to help with component-driven development, there's this really cool tool called Storybook. And this lets us do exactly what we need to. You can develop your components in isolation from your app. And Storybook gives you a way to look at all of these things in isolation and play around with the different props you can pass. Maybe there's some data that you want to see how it affects the components. Storybook lets you do that without you ever having to start up your app. And it also helps document all of your components. So if you've started a new job and they're just like, well, here's your task list, get in there and fix bugs. And the first thing you do, you start looking around and you're like, well, I don't actually know which props this component has. I'm not sure what data I should be expecting from the back end. Which colors should this be if it's in a different state? Storybook helps you document all of that as you go so that when another developer comes along or you come back after 6 months, you know what the component actually does and the functionality behind it. And you can play with it a little bit to get more comfortable with these components. And of course, we all love writing tests, right? Yes, we do. No, we typically don't. But we're supposed to write tests. And Storybook helps make that easier because as you're developing these components in isolation, you start to see the different edge cases and the conditions that you need to account for when you do add these components to the whole page. So this makes it easier to write tests because you're not actually trying to test a whole page. You're just making sure that if your buttons, if your form has some fields with improper values, is the button gray? There you go. You can test the different states of these components without having to call APIs, without having to worry about what the other components are doing. You can just write very small, simple tests that build up over time and give you that confidence you need in deploying your apps. Like just about an hour ago, I actually ended up using Storybook to check some changes for a deploy we did this morning. And we caught a really, really bad bug because we were testing in isolation. There was this form that did not have any validation on it, which we don't want those out in the wild. So Storybook and component-driven development helps you find those kind of issues before they get smothered by all of the other issues that pop up in your app. So we're going to get to Redwood a little bit later, but first I wanted to show you how to add Storybook to existing projects, because that's something that'll probably happen a lot more than just starting everything from scratch. It's so complicated. It's so very complicated to add Storybook. You just have to run this one command in your terminal, in your project, and Storybook does its thing and sets up the configs. It adds some example stories, and then you can start to add your own stories based on whatever components you have. But this is the command that you use to add Storybook to a new project, an existing project. Don't think it matters if it's in React, Angular, Vue, whatever framework you use. But that's it. So we're going to add Storybook to an existing project and look at a live demo, because I checked this morning and everything worked before I came here. So it should still be working. And then, is that font size big enough for y'all? Good. So I did think about running that command live, but with the Wi-Fi connection, probably not the best idea. So I went ahead and just set this up, and you'll see this is just a regular old Create React app. Nothing too crazy here. So I ran Storybook, and it's added a couple of files for us. Well, more than a couple, but we'll get into the stories a little bit later. So right now, the main thing that I want you to notice is this Storybook main file. This is where all of the configs for the Storybook server goes. So if there's any add-ons or things you want to make sure Storybook does for you, this is where you'll update those. So for example, you probably want to make sure you have this add-on essentials, because it gives you the cool functionality that Storybook has, which we're going to see in just a second. And then we have this preview file, and this just kind of dictates how Storybook renders things once we start up the server. And then we have some stories. These are just here from what Storybook added when we ran that command in our terminal. So if I go ahead and start up my Storybook server, it's definitely not gonna crash. That's the first thing. And it didn't. That was nice. Okay. So this is what Storybook looks like when you first set it up. It has a bunch of, documentation to help you get started, but the important part is over here in the stories. So remember when I kind of mentioned the add-on essentials? The point of having that add-on is so that we get these little, what's the right word? We get the add-ons bar down here. So we have our controls, which tell us what we want to change with this button up here. So if I come in here, and I have no idea what this color will be, but you see right there, it's little stuff like this that makes it a lot easier to develop a full app. Because think about it. Normally, you would have to start up your whole app, wait for it to connect to the API. Maybe you have to log in, and then you have to style this button. That just takes way more time than just doing it right here. So if we make this a not primary button, you can see the style change. You can change the text or text. So we can change the size here. And if we click it, we get a little action over here that tells us, hey, you clicked the button. But this is some of the stuff that Storybook makes it easy to develop with. And if I switch back over to code, let's take a look at what's happening in the button and the story. So first, let's look at the button. It's just a regular old button. We have some props that we pass into it. And of course, we have different modes, whatever. It's just a button with some props, some styles, and a label. And that's it. So hopefully nothing too crazy in here. But over here in the stories is where things get a little bit more interesting. So we import our button component, no surprise there. And then this export statement happens. So for Storybook, this export default defines how this component will be rendered in Storybook. And we've given it this title, which if I switch back over here, oh, well, never mind, that's not what I thought it was. So we've given it a title, we have it as this button, which is this button component, and we have some archetypes. So the thing with archetypes is if you have a prop that you want to kind of manipulate differently, you'll use an archetype, because here we have this background color, which would probably be a string normally. But if you notice over here in the browser, we actually have this color selector. So that's just one of the examples of what you can do with the archetype. It just gives you more control over the props that you pass in here. And then the part that makes Storybook so useful is this template. So this template just defines like the button for this story. And as you can see, we pass in some args which represent our props. But Storybook uses this args parameter to determine what is shown down here in our controls. So anything that you put in the args will be down here in the controls for that component. And you see, we have a few different button types. So they all have different arguments, which is totally normal, nothing too surprising here. But this is how you start writing stories in Storybook. So if I come over here and look at the other buttons, you'll notice they all have the same controls And that's just because Storybook takes the args for anything in that particular story, and it automatically goes to the controls. And I don't know if you can tell right here. Let me see if I can zoom in a bit. But you can actually set certain controls to be required. So if I take this out, it doesn't do what we want it to do. And then if I put it back, there we go. So it seems really simple just because Storybook makes it super easy to make these kind of changes and see how it actually affects the components on the screen. But something else Storybook does is that documentation I was talking about, right? So here you can see what all of those different props for this button actually mean. You can see the types for them, and you can still change things right here as you're looking through the documentation. So just imagine if you're onboarding 3 new UI engineers and they all have to learn how to use your entire component library, which has over 100 components in it, because at some point everybody was running around a little bit crazy. So now at least you have documentation for all of those weird components nobody really knows what does anymore, because they don't have to know what they do anymore. The docs tell everyone what they're for. So you see you can look at the code and copy for specific buttons, which makes it super easy to get through your development. It's just Storybook, so it just does so much for you. It's pretty nice. You can even look at this component in complete isolation from Storybook just to see how it looks on the screen, if that's something else that you need. But one thing I do want to point out is that Storybook isn't just for components. You can actually test whole pages if you want to. It just helps when you are starting with component-driven development. Don't worry about your pages. Just worry about getting the components in those states correct. And then when you put them in the pages, you have less of a nightmare to deal with when you need to go in and redo everything because stakeholders decided they don't want that feature anymore. So here's an example of just a page in Storybook. We got some text here, not that important. We can actually set like a user login if we want to. We can log out, which this is the logged out page, or I guess it has this create action thing. But if we don't know what is happening in here, we have documentation, but not on this part. Oh, there it is up here. So just some docs on what's happening with these different parameters that we pass in. So let's take a look at that page real quick. If you look here, this is the page that we're testing in Storybook, and we have those props that you saw in the controls, and we have this header component, which also has a story, and we'll get into that in a second. But I just want to make sure that you see how all of this is connected. There's no real magic happening here. It's just Storybook taking what you already have and making it easier to work with. So if I switch back over to the browser and we take a look at this header, this is where we can see things happening. What happened to where did my controls go? One thing that is a little bit weird with Storybook, sometimes this controls panel just disappears and you have to go in here and toggle the orientation. I don't get it. I was looking up the issue this morning and it looks like it's just there. So be aware that that might happen to you. But this is just what the header looks like. These are some docs behind it. And that's kind of the gist of it with Storybook. So you have everything you need for your components right here. You don't have to load the app. You can just finagle with things. So if I wanted to add another button for whatever reason, let's say we wanted to do dark mode. We're using that same template that all of the other button types are using, which uses the same button component, and we're gonna pass in a different set of args. So this time we'll make it a large button, and we'll say dark mode. And I guess we should probably give it some kind of background color because it is dark mode. I always forget, is black 000 or FFF? Zeros, got it. Thank you. All right, so you see it rebuilt. And if we come back here, we got the dark mode button. It doesn't work like I thought it would, but that's okay. I'm just gonna, why doesn't it have my label? Oh, that makes sense. I'm not calling the right button. Gotta make sure you make those little updates. Okay, now we have dark mode. So this doesn't look right. It's something that would probably come up in testing naturally. We probably need to make this true, just so that we get the right styles applied. But hopefully you can see how this brings you through debugging a lot faster than if you were actually going through your app, making these changes in the code directly, looking at the page, making the change again, and doing that a bunch of times. So it saves you a lot of time on iterations. It saves you a lot of time on developing components that don't actually work the way you think they should. And it just saves you a lot of time on maintenance as you continue to add components to your app and as you continue to group those things together. You don't have to worry as much about how these things are interacting and affecting each other because you already know what happens anytime you change a particular prop. I guess, were there any questions about this so far? Or does this seem pretty straightforward?
Have you ever come across a scenario where you build a page in Storybook and then you have to convince the client that it's actually just magic and not done yet?
I've had to convince some clients of a lot of things that are magic and not done yet. But with Storybook in particular, I haven't had that issue. Usually it makes it easier to do demos for clients because you don't have to have the whole thing done. And you're like, hey, I have this one page, this is it, but it's fully functional. So this is what it'll look like when we integrate it into the rest of the app. That's usually how I handle that with Storybook. Because I know what you mean. Sometimes clients are like, oh, this page is done. That means the whole app is done, right? No, it doesn't. But were there any other questions just about Storybook things in general?
I've never used the pages functionality of Storybook.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear what you guys are saying of building it in isolation and being able to see it in isolation. I'm not sure I'm sold on the value of doing that versus
Just doing development.
Side of the application.
Mm-hmm. A lot of times it just makes it easier for people who aren't working on the code base to interact with, because you can just send them a link and be like, hey, how does this look? It helps with QA a lot too.
It's like a code sandbox.
Yeah.
So you have a blog post, and the designer's design is to never overclose the header. Like you have a table or the blog's 4 sentences long title.
Yeah.
And you can pop that into Storybook and show them that like,
That's not gonna work.
your content doesn't break your site, and this is
Yeah. Storybook is kind of like the developer's way of saying, I told you so. Because you can literally pull up this page and be like, well, you wanted this, but this is what it looks like. Are you sure? And now you haven't spent all that time trying to make sure that it's wired up correctly and that it's pulling the right data. It's just there, which is magic in itself, but at the same time, we do know what's happening under the hood. Okay, so were there any other questions? Like, there are literally no dumb questions, because I've asked them all. Yeah.
Curious how you're organizing your storybook files. So I have the storybook and you and so I'll have all the components in there, but sometimes I have like just a CSS only component, right? It's not its own name component, but does it seem like loose NDX files just hang around? Wondering what do you do with those? Do you have a specific organization structure you use?
Yes, and actually we're about to get to that when we jump into Redwood. So thanks for the perfect segue. So I'm gonna come back here, and we've already seen how to add Storybook. We've seen what the buttons do. We've seen how it actually works. So we're gonna switch it up a little bit because I've been playing with this framework called Redwood this year, and it's pretty hefty. So it's a full stack JavaScript framework, but you can argue that it's a full stack Jamstack framework. It's still up for debate. But basically, Redwood handles a lot of things out of the box for you. The front end is created with React. The back end is handled by GraphQL, and your database connection stuff is handled by Prisma. So it's a pretty sturdy tech stack. And we're going to look at it right now. So I'm going to stop this other Storybook server and open another folder maybe. It's a big maybe. Yes. Okay, so now we are in a Redwood app, and this will actually hopefully answer your question about how to organize the Storybook components themselves. But quick walk through Redwood first. The main two folders that we work with are the API directory, which has all of your GraphQL types and resolvers, plus your database connections and queries and all that good stuff. And then the web directory has all of your front end. So typically, I try to structure my front end kind of like what Redwood does, just because it's efficient. I don't know if that's quite the right word. But here, the way that they handle Storybook is that you have these different components, pages, layouts, whatever it is, and inside that component folder, you have the component itself, the Storybook story, and the test file. So it keeps everything bundled together. Does that kind of answer your question? Yep. So basically, the best way that I've seen to maintain Storybook components is to just have a folder with that particular component and throw everything in there. That way you don't have these random files just hanging out in the root of your project. But with Redwood, you don't have to set up Storybook. It just comes built in along with a lot of other stuff like Auth0 integration. It has some, I think it works with Vercel. It just has a bunch built into it. It's a little ridiculous, but it's pretty awesome. So here, same thing. It's Storybook. Once you've seen one story, I promise you can just start writing a bunch of them. But same thing, we have some kind of type, a label, a size. But one difference that I do want to show with Storybook, if I remember the right command. Oh. So with Redwood, it comes with accessibility integration in Storybook automatically, which I'm not sure if you've been following along, but a lot of companies have been getting sued because their websites aren't accessible. And Redwood just kind of bakes that in so that you're basically forced to think about it as you go through development. But here, it's just the same thing that you saw earlier, is just in a Redwood project. But one thing that I do want to point out is this title again. So here you see this component/button. If I switch over, you see we have this component section. So you're able to group things too. If you want to have your pages separate from your components, which I strongly advise you do that, then this is probably the approach that you would take. So Storybook does whatever you tell it to do. If you want to have a page, it's gonna render that page. If you give it a title, it's gonna group whatever components that you want, whatever views you want under that specific title. So if you're telling somebody else, oh, just go look at this page, they actually know which directory to go to and they don't have to click around and try to figure things out. So Storybook makes things really clean for us. It keeps it simple and together, if that makes sense. And then the thing with Redwood is just, again, I personally just really like this framework because if I close this and just start up the regular old app server, it starts up the GraphQL instance, the React instance, connects to my database, and gives me a fully functional app without me having to write any code at all, which is incredible to me because if I can find a shortcut to not write code, it's not cheating. It's just being clever, right? If I can remember the right URL for the server. Let me see. Where is? No, not in there. It is that. Okay. So if I go to here, I'm not sure why that server hasn't started up. But one thing to keep in mind with Redwood, if you do think about playing with it, it's still very much in beta, so it's not stable yet. And there have been some breaking changes lately that I don't know. If you've made that update from Webpack v4 to v5, you probably already know how painful it is to have to manually add those polyfills now. But I digress. Storybook doesn't have to use Webpack, which is great. Or at least we don't have to worry about that kind of thing with Storybook. It handles it for us. So that's really it when it comes to stories and Storybook. And I guess that means I can probably go ahead and wrap up. There are just a couple of things that I hope that y'all got out of today. And it's just seeing how component-driven development can make your long-term maintainability easier. Because as you go through the life cycle of an app, the original developers probably aren't going to be around forever. So you do need a way to make sure that this can be maintained without the person who initially wrote the app. And then Redwood does bootstrap a lot of things for you. Once you have your database schema set up, there's one command that you can run that generates your GraphQL types, your resolvers, and the CRUD that goes along with it, with a styled front end, which is insane to me. But the main thing that I really hope you take today is to just keep trying new stuff. Like, there's so many tools out there, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Just try new things, because you'd be surprised at how well some of this stuff will fix the problems that you already have. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up. And again, if you want any more, content about those new things and tools, just follow me on Twitter at FlippedCoding. But I do just want to open it up if there's any more questions. Yeah.
You had said that Redwood builds in the accessibility portion of Storybook. Is that something that you can utilize about Redwood easily, or how do you build that into your Storybook project if it's not using Redwood?
That is actually pretty easy to do, honestly. It's just an add-on. So Storybook has a bunch of different add-ons, as you can see. So that accessibility one, if you are working with Storybook and you do, because you do want to make your components accessible, this is a great add-on to include. I guess, were there any other questions?
Does Redwood have any mock API capabilities? And so that it doesn't actually take your database. If you want to say you put a component, some data component inside a Storybook, but you want to lock that out. So that you're not, every time you spin up a Storybook, you're not blowing up your database. Wasn't me. Does it have any kind of mocking like that?
I'm not sure if Redwood has any mock API things. I would have to dig into that some more, but if they don't, the best thing that I could recommend is just having either your array or your object right there in the story, which would probably be better just for documentation purposes so that other people know what data to expect coming in. But,
It'd be cool if we could eventually stitch models into tabs and Storybook and see what models feeds into your components.
that would be pretty cool. Maybe one day they'll get that. Or maybe they have it and it's just some advanced stuff that I haven't used yet. But any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, speaking with accessibility. So you said Redwood has that built into it. What's the engine that powering their accessibility validator?
Ooh.
Does it say? So,
I'm
more
not sure.
specifically, this one here says that it passed.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what it's actually checking because
I see what your question
there's a
is.
problem with contrast on there.
Yeah.
So you have the dark gray with black text. That doesn't work for individuals with low vision.
Right. So one thing that you can do with this accessibility add-on, there's this little vision simulator up here. Let me see if I can make that bigger. But it actually gives you a way to look at this button from different issues that people might have working with it. But as far as it detecting stuff like bad colors, I'm not quite sure if Redwood or Storybook has anything built in for that. I would have to dig through their documentation.
Okay, just curious. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Now I need to go find that out. Any other questions, comments, queries about life? Well, if not, I'm going to stop standing up here awkwardly and just sit around awkwardly and see if y'all have any questions. But thanks for coming.